Happy 40-man roster deadline day to all who celebrate here on the Guardians of the CLE podcast. I am your host, Melanie Kirby, and with me here as always is my co-host, James Ellifritz. And lucky for us, we have with us tonight someone who does in fact celebrate 40-man roster deadline day, and someone who has graciously taken time out of his very busy schedule as a father, husband, co-host of the Selby as Godcast, and Guardians beat reporter for The Athletic, and I'm sure much, much more. But he's here to join us tonight. We have the great Zack Meisel. Zack, thank you for being with us on this actually crazy night of Guardians news.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think 40-man roster deadline day probably ranks somewhere between like Earth Day and Flag Day for me on the list of holidays.
Sometimes this is the most exciting part of the offseason, those of us who just follow that prospect movement in and off of the roster. But hey, I hope you at least had a chance to catch your breath after this immensely fun season before this award season and all these roster decisions began. Has your coffee intake slowed at all?
After the season, I went cold turkey. So I think I've had one cup since. I was in Vegas and it was NFL Sunday and I needed to get up early to claim a seat at the sports book. So I made an exception of the rule there. But yeah, no, I baseball season is weird. Terry Francona always says it. It's like sports are the one thing where you're going 100 miles an hour, and in baseball, it's at that speed from February to October, and then you just hit a wall and it stops, and you don't know what to do with yourself. So when you're being fueled by nothing but coffee for a while there during a crazy postseason stretch, it's an adjustment. You get to the off season, you have that hankering, but you try to say no.
You know, I think it's funny you mentioned that, kind of running into that brick wall, kind of that emotional hangover once the season ends. You know, I think I can speak for a lot of Guardians fans when I can say we kind of experienced the same things. All this excitement, what's going to happen in the postseason? You know, who's going to be the stars of the postseason? But wait, I think Jose has a thumb injury and all these questions. But overall, this team just brought us so much joy and excitement over the summer. I mean, exceeding expectations, so many likable personalities. Stephen Kwan coming in third in Rookie of the Year voting yesterday when Tito wasn't even sure he'd play every day, I believe, when the team left Goodyear. Was this one of your most fun groups to cover? And, you know, fresh off Tito's Manager of the Year. Happy 40-man roster. Is this maybe one of his most successful as a manager, considering the roster limitations?
Yes, I think Tito has said it, like this group energized him, and there were times during the season when he didn't know what his future held. He didn't know if he'd want to keep doing this, how long he'd physically be able to keep doing this. But the way they played and the refreshing style of baseball that they played really gave him that boost he needed, and he wins Manager of the Year.
Go
They obviously had a
Guardians.
successful season, and he wants to come back. So it was similar. I mean, this was such a different season. I think back to those first few years under Francona, and it was there was some 2013 had a crazy stretch at the end of September, but 3 hours in the playoffs and they were out. And most of that season they were trying to like find their footing and figure out what they had. The next two seasons were underwhelming. 2016 is obviously memorable, but that team was full of veterans and they knew by mid-June they had something. This team is so young and inexperienced. Nobody knew exactly what this was going to look like. And it took until September when they just steamrolled everybody in their path, I think, for everybody to really believe and to start imagining what was possible. So for me, I mean, it was, like I went on parental leave in late May and I was out for about a month. And when I came back, it was like, okay, this team is like fine. And they had a nice little run. They had a good stretch against the Twins, and that got them into first place, and they fell back a little bit. And you were just trying to see if they could hang around and play meaningful games in September. I didn't anticipate what we saw. Yeah. And I think I went into that stretch against there was the trip in Minnesota, and then the week later, the trip in Chicago. And I kind of treated that as the playoffs. And I said, let's just have coffee oozing out of my pores and let's cover this 100% and just work my, do we swear on this podcast? Can I say work my ass
Yeah,
off?
it does happen.
Work my ass off thinking, like this was, I didn't think the team was going to play until October 19th. So I ended up, I mean, it was just exhausted at the end because what an incredible run. And there were just so many memorable things that happened. And young players rising to the occasion. So it was a season that was rewarding to cover because there was so much to write, so many players to talk about that you didn't foresee. No one could have foreseen this sort of magical movie script.
And I can imagine the way this team ended the season, that this offseason and going into spring training is going to be like no other because, typically your veterans like the offseason, whereas this team is so young. I imagine the spring training next year, they're just going to be so eager to get back after losing their COVID season in 2020, the lockout last year. I can only anticipate and feel that this team cannot wait to get to Arizona next year just to pick up where they left off.
Yeah, I think there's a benefit to having young players who get a taste of it. Now, in 2014, after they made the wild card game the previous October, Nick Swisher brought a box full of t-shirts to the clubhouse at the beginning of spring training, and they said unfinished business on them. And he passed them around the clubhouse. Everybody got all excited. And then that team won 84 games, I think, and fell short. So you never know. You still need young players to develop, and you still need just better performances. You still have to go out on the field and produce. But yeah, then that 2013 team was a little older too. I think there's still young players who might see the fact that, okay, Oscar Gonzalez, I think he's probably going to be aware that George Valera is lurking behind him if he struggles, right? Like Miles Straw, if he's hitting 170 in May, maybe Will Brennan is there to take some of his at bats. So I think there's like a healthy collection of young players. And I think getting that first experience in big games is invaluable.
Speaking of that outfield talent, I think it may have gone better than anybody could have possibly imagined, evaluating all this young talent this season. And maybe most impressively, they went from an organization that struggles to develop outfield talent to now having a logjam of these talented young guys in the outfield, some of which you mentioned, the Stephen Kwan, Will Brennan, Will Benson, Oscar Gonzalez, Nolan Jones, George Valera. What do you see them possibly doing with all these guys who, play some of these three outfield positions? Could they maybe capitalize on this and try and include them in part of a trade? Do you think they'd ever consider moving Miles Straw to that fourth outfielder spot, maybe give Will Brennan more run in center field? They just have so many options.
Yeah, at some point they're going to have to just pick the guys they like and roll with them. And I think it's really complicated. I mean, you laid out, I don't know, 5 or 6 different storylines in that one question alone, because it's just, there are so many young players that you want to get a look at, but if you give enough time to make a full evaluation, you're costing else somebody time. So you can't get a full evaluation of everybody, especially when you're trying to contend.
Yeah.
So yeah, they have to consolidate at some point and package 3 prospects for Sean Murphy or some established major league player. But you have to, the prospects you're going to trade have to be good enough that another team wants them, but not so good that you don't want to part with them. And that's just the trickiest balance to strike in trading, period. So it'll be interesting. I don't know if they'll be able to pull it off. I've talked to people who have said, like, we've considered that sort of trade, or we've pursued that sort of trade for over a year, but it has to be the right one to make it happen. It is crazy. I mean, this is the first offseason I can remember, I don't know, maybe ever, where outfield is not at the top of their offseason priority list.
Yeah.
And they've gone from having nothing but question marks out there to having 3, 4, 5, 6 capable players that you want to see at some point in 2023. So they have depth. It's just making sure you can use your surplus at one spot to address deficiency at another.
And that's, with this team exceeding expectations, I would think the next, goal is to take that step forward in 2023 and try to maybe mesh some veterans who have been there before with this great group of young talent that we have. To do that, we have to be able to beat good teams consistently, especially with this new balance schedule, we have starting next season. Do you foresee there being the financial flexibility to maybe add that lefty mashing first baseman or a starting pitcher to kind of pair with the top 3 we have to kind of push this team over the hump a little bit?
I don't know exactly. I don't, they haven't set a number or a range they'd like to get to payroll wise, and it remains to be seen what the influence of the new minority ownership group is going to have. We haven't heard from David Blitzer, so no one knows like what his goals are in that role. I don't think they're going to have $140 million payroll like they did 5 years ago, but there should be some wiggle room. You're building up. You're trying to cement yourself as not just a cute little story of, hey, this little engine that could won 92 games and made the playoffs. Trying to cement yourself as a World Series contender.
Right.
And how do you get on the Astros level? How do you get on the Yankees, the Mariners, the Blue Jays level? I think doing what you're saying is a big part of that. They have to, you've got good depth, but a lot of that depth is untested. And you can't just assume that all of these nice stories from 2022 are going to play out the same way in 2023. Someone is going to regress. Oscar Gonzalez is going to struggle to reach base because pitchers are going to just not throw him strikes, or Tristan McKenzie gets injured. Like, stuff happens. So you have to be prepared. And while they have a lot of interesting pieces behind those guys, many of them are just young and inexperienced. So shore up first base DH with Trey Mancini or Jose Abreu and go fortify your starting rotation. I mean, there are upgrades to make. I think they know that. It's just there are different ways to go about fixing those things because you do have prospects to trade. And they're certainly not the type of team that's going to go out and sign a really interesting free agent on November 15th. So we know how that typically plays out.
We got a little while still.
Zach, is there any past history of the franchise with ownership deciding payroll based on, and I'm sure this has to be part of it behind the scenes, but just attendance in general? It's not the 90s. The population in the area has decreased from the 455 straight sellouts. Is that something, what are we missing to get people down to the ballpark again? I mean, the television coverage is fantastic. We got, great announcers that we really enjoy the game with, but to get draw down to the stadium, do you think that has a major part of the decision of the payroll and how they set it instead of win losses?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more nuanced than that. I mean, there's probably a ton of things that go into it that I'm not privy to. Someone had told me, I don't know, a year or two ago that like for where their attendance typically is at this point, like 90 to 110 million is the sweet spot for payroll. But I don't know what other factors contribute to that. And you have to include the pandemic, at least the past couple of years, into that equation. So I don't know, what percent, like, all right, we're ready to win, let's spend, versus well, the attendance is this. I don't know like how much weight they give each thing. So
Right.
I'm not sure. And also it's different people are involved. John Sherman, he wasn't calling the shots necessarily when he was minority owner, but he was basically a partner with Paul Dolan. And so, what those conversations were might have been different when Sherman left and Dolan's deciding this stuff on his own, and might be different now that he's got other people on board. So it's sort of just a big question mark. I do know one thing is down, like the renovations, they hope will play a part in this, in just drawing more people to the ballpark. And down the road, and this is what Blitzer's, I think his top project will be, is creating a district around the ballpark where you draw people in, not just for tonight's 7:10 start, but get them to go to a restaurant, to go to a shop around the ballpark. And even if they're not huge baseball fans, maybe they mosey on into Progressive Field afterwards, because it's a whole day. And they think that can bring revenue in too. So the tough thing is, like, there's never a quick fix. I mean, we saw it with Edwin Encarnacion. They got a bump the year after, but it's just there are more things that go into it, and they haven't cracked that code by now, and it's almost 2023. So it's going to take a while to figure it out, and we may never see 32,000 in the stadium every night again. That might just take a perfect storm.
Yeah, and I believe a lot of it has to do with the style of play. The 90s were a lot of home runs, and that puts butts in seats. But this style of play is more small ball, and I would say it takes maybe the casual fan out of it a little bit more, except for your diehards. The diehards like Mel and I that absolutely love to go to the stadium, just because we love every bit and piece of the sport of baseball.
Yeah, I also don't know like how much of it is a Cleveland problem versus an MLB problem. I mean, I know personally, like, you can hand me Browns tickets, but I'm gonna just give them away to someone else because I want to spend a Sunday on my couch in front of the TV paying attention to every single game I can, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I just think every sport has a different dynamic in that sense. With baseball, it's 81 home games. I understand it's a lot. And it's asking a lot too. If you live in the suburbs, say, and you get off work and you go home and you pick up your family really quick and you drive downtown and you pay to park and you pay for the tickets and you pay for food. Like it's a lot. And you get home late and then you go straight to bed and you wake up for work the next day saying, boy, was that all worth it to sit through a 6-1 loss with a 2-hour rain delay, even though it wasn't raining?
Yeah.
It's tough. I think there are just a lot of factors in play. I'm sure if I carved out 3 months of time, I could come up with like a 15-part series on it. Maybe it would be a good like podcast series topic, but it's I wish there were more people in the stands, and I know the team wishes there were more people in the stands, and you see those playoff games and you feel the energy. I mean, like that place when it is full,
They were electric.
environment, yeah, it's as good as any in the league. So
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe people will have bought in after the 2022 season, and attendance will go up.
I think a big thing too with people, just kind of common fans in my family and people at work I talk to, a lot of these people had no idea who any of these guys were outside of Jose Ramirez, Shane Bieber, even, Emmanuel Clase to a certain extent. I obviously think that's going to change moving forward with just some of the notoriety these guys have gotten, deservedly so, from their play this season. And I think that's the thing with this team is we have homegrown talent. They stick around for a few years, and then people get upset when they either trade them or they don't sign them to that extension. And I think that was so big with Jose Ramirez signing that extension in spring training. I was at my 8-year-old nephew's baseball game sometime in the summer, and at least 6 kids on his team were like, "Oh, I'm Jose Ramirez. Did you see that hit? I look just like Jose." And that extension, from what I'm seeing, it was bigger than baseball. Like, he has kids in this city looking up to him, almost like Nick Chubb with the Browns, Darius Garland with the Cavs. He is that guy that kids who play baseball in this city, they want to play like him. They want to be like Jose Ramirez and lose their helmet when they're flying around the bases and just play with that hustle and that intensity that he has. And I think as fans, start to get to know these guys, the Steven Kwans, the Oscar Gonzalez. I mean, how can you not after the postseason he had? I think it's going to help. But then we look at the other side of it, and who could we lose to trades in the offseason? So it's balancing. You want fans to know who these guys are, but you're obviously constantly looking to improve your team as well with some of these log jams we have. So as far as guys like Zach Plesac, Aaron Savali, although maybe not the most noteworthy with bands, could we see potentially some guys on the move this offseason, in your opinion?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're gonna have like 12 pitchers, starting pitchers at AAA. The way it's set up right now. I mean, you already have Cody Morris, Xavion Curry, Hunter Gaddis, Logan Allen. The Espino and Williams and Bybee are on the cusp of AAA, and there's more. So it makes sense to trade someone like Plesac. I think it's made sense for about a year now, and that doesn't mean they shouldn't also go try to upgrade the rotation at the same time. And you look in a playoff series, and if you can roll out Bieber, McKenzie, and another frontline starter, that's going to be tough to match for any opponent. So a lot of things I'm sure they're kicking around. To your first point, I mean, I think that's the key is how do you build the connection with the fan base and the way to draw more people in. That's why I said all offseason, I was shouting it for a year and a half. You can't let Jose Ramirez go. You have to build around something at some point. The way the Rays operate, where it's just a constant churn and they've got young, cheap talent coming and going, it's worked for them because they're incredible at identifying talent, and especially on the pitching side, just finding 15 relievers every season who can have a sub-3 ERA. But nobody goes to their games, and there's a million reasons for it. And the location and quality of the ballpark is a big one, but so is the fact that you can't get the average person walking down the street to name 2 people on their roster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They finally did pony up and sign Wander Franco to a long-term contract, but for the longest time, I mean, they would trade guys. I mean, they traded Blake Snell with like 3 years left of team control. So it just makes it so hard to establish a relationship with your fan base. And if they're lucky that Jose Ramirez basically knocked down the door and demanded a below market deal, because otherwise he was going to be dealt. And if he's dealt, then there's no reason to keep Shane Bieber. And then the jokes people have been making since the days of CC Sabathia and Cliff Lee were never going to end. And there's still going to be some. I think I saw someone recently say, how much longer is Quan going to be here before they trade him? It's like, I don't know, like 6 years maybe. But it gave you a foundation, and you have new Guardians merchandise that you were rolling out in the spring. And I'm sure how many people would have been pissed off if they bought a Jose Ramirez Guardians jersey in March only to see him traded 2 weeks later, right?
Yeah. Right.
So you built around something. You gave your fan base a reason to invest. Now you have to keep doing that. Who's going to be the next part of this core? You're going to lock up Jimenez? You're going to lock up Quan? You're going to lock up McKenzie? Are you going to go find someone else you can trade for to add to that group? So I think that kind of helps what Jamie was talking about. Is just making sure you've got people you can build around that fans can identify. Because you guys referenced the 90s. Everybody knows every member of that lineup in 95. They were all household names. Mm-hmm. And You saw all their jerseys in the stands, and people wanted to go see their favorite player. Like you can rebuild that in a way.
You mentioned in another interview with Jeremy Schaap, you were talking about the importance. We were talking about all the offense, but you were talking about adding Oral Hershiser to that roster. Does this roster? We've talked for several podcasts now that we have to have veteran leadership. Like it's to the point to where, yes, we are talented and we are young, but to be the first team to make it as far as we did since the '86 Mets, history tells us it's going to be a struggle next year, even though we're in a lighter division. And who knows what Jose Abreu is going to do with the White Sox, plus other free agents. Do we have to have veterans, not just starting pitcher, but one in the bullpen and also in our lineup?
Yeah, I think it helps. I mean, Brian Shaw is Brian Shaw, but he did make a difference out in that bullpen.
I told you, Mel.
You called it.
And even, I mean, everyone leads in different ways, right? It's
right.
Jose Ramirez is not the most vocal guy. He's not going to tell you what to do necessarily, but he's going to lead by example. Even Ahmed Rosario did that. I don't know. What about someone like Corey Kluber? I mean, if you trade Plesac and you want to fill that spot for a year before the Espino and Williams and Bibees are ready, then what about Kluber for a year? Like someone like that, I think could help. And it doesn't have to be a starting pitcher. They're like any of the first base TH types they might be interested in, I think would fit that mold. It's got to be the right guy though, because you can't just bring someone in on a 1-year contract. And I think Mike Napoli played that role perfectly. He signed a 1-year deal. He didn't know most of those guys coming in, and he made an effort to. I mean, he was playing cards with a young Jose Ramirez in the middle of the clubhouse every afternoon. Not everyone can do that, but yeah, I think that would help a lot because you've got a lot of young guys who are going to just go in there thinking, all right, year 2, this is the year I dominate and we win the World Series, and it might not go according to plan. It helps to have that veteran presence who can kind of just give you reinforcement that, what you're doing is still going to work in the long run.
We only got about 5 or 6 minutes left here. What do you do with Ahmed Rosario? What's the future for Ahmed Rosario look like in Cleveland? I can't believe we went this long without really mentioning him. He's so polarizing on Twitter.
Right. So that's why I'll just take the safe option and say he plays out the 2023 season on his last year of his team control and then hits free agency and someone else takes over, one of their 4,000 shortstop prospects.
Yeah. There's plenty ready to take the reins too. That is going to be exciting to see. James, did you have anything else?
I want to talk about the bottom of the lineup that it really got magnified in the playoffs is, the 8-9 spot. So you got your catcher spots, you got Miles Straw. And we talked earlier, can Miles Straw be that fourth outfielder? I don't see it happening to start the season, but maybe as some of the younger guys, maybe like you talked about Will Brennan getting more reps out in center field. Can he be that fourth? Can he play right field as well? But then also the catching spot. Is Bo Naylor the guy to look out for next year, or is it the veteran catcher that we potentially could be bringing in via trade?
Yeah, so I think my prediction would be Straw's your opening day center fielder, and if he's not hitting, they gradually reduce his number of at-bats and either stick Brennan in there or slide Kwan over, and whichever outfield, whether it's Brennan or, well, Nolan Jones isn't in that conversation anymore, but Brennan or Valera or Noel or whoever else is in consideration there, you've got options. At catcher, I mean, they want to add somebody. So I think Hedges is kind of like okay, if we have to, but I think they'd prefer Sean Murphy or someone of that caliber if they can get him, because asking a 22-year-old catcher, even though Bo Naylor they think the world of him offensively and defensively, hit a phenomenal breakout 2022 season. There's room for both. You don't want Naylor catching 150 games. And so you can ease him in. You can have a better catcher also playing catcher. There's a DH spot that they never filled after Franmil Reyes left. Josh Naylor hasn't proven he can hit lefties. So if any of these guys can play first base, that's an option too. So there's flexibility. I think it's instrumental. It's imperative that they improve the bottom of that lineup. They shore it up. You can't have 2 or 3 automatic outs down there anymore. And not just that, I think you need another bat in the middle of the order too. Someone who has some power. The small ball approach was great. It worked for the personnel they had, but that doesn't mean you have to stick with that. You can have elements of that mixed with some power hitters and just better overall production from what was really 2 black holes in 2022.
I'm glad you clarified that Nolan Jones trade, because I know it was put out there as a mistype, and then there was all this movement going around with that particular deal. So we weren't sure if that one was official or not. But yes, it does look like Nolan Jones has been moved to the Rockies for what's it, Juan Brito, infielder?
Yeah.
So that's
he was
interesting.
in A-ball with the Rockies last season. And if you just scout the stat line, it's every element they love.
It's a Guardians guy.
Strikeouts, a bunch of stolen bases, started hitting for more power, a lot of extra base hits. So throw another middle infield prospect into the pile.
Yeah, this will be fun. On that note, we'll end on a high note. That's going to do it for this episode of the Guardians of the CLE podcast. Zach, are there any upcoming pieces or anything going on you want to alert the listeners to?
Nothing crazy. I don't think so. I'm trying to emerge. There's like a billion things I want to write that I have on my list, but I'm also slowly emerging from my postseason hibernation. So I can't decide what I want to write first and what I want to hold off on until the dead period of January. It feels like we're already in mid-November because they played so late into the season. So it feels like,
yeah, it's weird.
Like we're already like into the thick of the off season. Feels like it's going fast, but I know that this happens and we get to the winter meetings and everyone's got all this energy channeled toward what moves they might make. And then it's like January 23rd and we're still talking about the same thing. So
first base, please, first base.
Yeah.
End of January. Yeah. Well, Zach, thank you once again for joining us here tonight, for squeezing us in on this crazy roster deadline day. Everybody make sure you check out BelieveLandMediaLLC.com, where we've got you covered on all things Cleveland sports with our written content and podcasts for the professional, college, and high school levels. Thank you everybody for listening here tonight. Let's hope we all have an exciting offseason with lots of Guardians content to talk about. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and go Guardians.